A 30% tariff imposed by the U.S. President Donald Trump on South African imported goods has officially taken effect. Ahead of the implementation, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump spoke telephonically. They discussed bilateral trade and said their countries' negotiating teams will hold more detailed talks. Despite trying for months to negotiate a trade deal with Washington, an agreement could not be clinched ahead of Trump's deadline. So let's unpack it all with SABC News senior economics reporter Nompumelelo Siziba. Good morning. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to us.
Stuck in the morning. So this has now come into effect. We tried all sorts of avenues to try and avert it coming and the guillotine landing. It has now landed. What does it look like in our economy at the moment as we speak? Yeah. What are the implications? So
the implications in theory are that it's going to adversely affect South African exporters. The specific ones in mind are the motor manufacturers, the agricultural players, you know, the guys who export citrus, for example, wine, macadamia nuts, and some other sectors that are going to be affected. And so what that basically means is that if your good is worth $100, and that's what you want to sell it into the American market at $100, when it gets to the US port, the government there will then lob on $30, that is 30%, onto that good. And then the taker, the importer of that good, must pay that levy and then sell it on into the US market. Now, the big question is, how will the US market react to that? Is the importer going to continue importing the same level of volume? And if it does, will the US market bear that higher price? Or will it take some of the increase in terms of the tariff increase and then pass less on to the consumer? So there are a lot of variables that are going to have to take place along the way. And that depends on each individual sort of entrepreneur.
I like the practical example you give. So of that now levied $130 on the US side, what are the implications for the importer as well as the person for whom they're importing, the person that they onward sell to?
Yes.
The one permutation is you said they import less of the product from South Africa. What's the other permutation?
Yeah. So, well, what we're seeing already in the US economy is that inflation is a bit higher than not the Reserve Bank, the Fed Reserve would like. And hence, up until very recently, the Fed Reserve was saying, no, I need to see, you know, what's happening with these tariffs that are on the horizon before we can think about cutting rates. But then what happened was there was some data last week which showed that the US economy was not doing so well in terms of their labor stats. If the labor stats are low, there's a big worry because it means there are less people working and they can't contribute to the economy to the same degree. And one of the mandates that the US Fed has is that it has to look at employment. If that starts, if unemployment starts coming down a fair bit, they have to use the tools in their kit to be able to address that, one of them being interest rates. So now the markets are now factoring a 91% chance that there will be interest rate cuts in the United States come September because of that factor alone. And then, of course, there are concerns around what I outlined to you, that if people are now going to be having to pay that much more for a good that they were paying much less for the month before, it means there is going to be inflationary pressure. Yeah.
The question, I suppose, becomes, do they have such a penchant for the South African product that it doesn't matter, increase it higher, we'll continue to buy it? Or do they simply say, what are the alternatives, and therefore the demand drops?
That's right. I mean, if it's something like fruit, you know, you can decide, no, I'm not going to take this fruit. I'm going to rather take that fruit. We have competitors in the United States, the likes of Chile and Peru, who also export citrus to the US market. They're subject to 10% import levies. And of course, they're just on the doorstep of the United States. It's a lot costlier for South Africa to export, you know, in terms of logistics, and then to be lobbed on with that tariff as well. So it's tricky.
So thread it nicely then. That's offshore. That's the impact offshore upon the product landing on U.S. shores. But what is the impact on the back end here in South Africa? To put it, in common parlance, the impact on the ordinary person.
Yes.
The man on the streets.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is why I started my answer by saying in theory, because now we have a situation where these tariffs took effect in the South African context yesterday, that is on Friday. Now we need to see how the market reacts. Now, if Economics 101 teaches us correctly, we are going to see a decline in demand for South African goods. If that then happens, what does that mean for the producer of those goods? What decisions do they have to take? Are they going to continue to see how it goes, or are they going to preempt what they expect to happen, that is a decline in demand, in which case it means that they cut production. If you cut production and you use a lot of labor in that process, you're going to fire people, or you're going to, lessen your load in terms of the people who are working for you. So that's the real threat. We haven't yet seen it yet. So we need to give it time to see what happens, but there will be preemptive decisions, I'm sure, by some. And that will mean, job losses. Of course, the government has come in to say that they have created this export support desk where exporters can speak to them about some of the solutions that they can be looking at in the short term, so that they can try and prevent some 30,000 jobs being lost. But whatever they do, it's going to only be a temporary measure, because you need a sustainable situation. You need markets. So the other thing, of course, is that looking for alternative markets, that's not something that can happen overnight.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to go to a different point, but I like where you are now, looking for alternative markets. That's almost something that's heard glibly, right?
That's right.
Easier said than done.
That's right. Yeah.
And it takes a while. There's a lag and
it's
all
a
sorts of
process.
toing and froing until you are settled. Yeah,
you've got to do your market research. There obviously the markets you may be looking at may already be served. And there are all sorts of implications. But the bottom line is that it's not going to happen overnight. And it was interesting to hear the Minister of DTIC, Parks Tau, saying, yes, we're looking at other markets. But actually, even if you're looking at other markets, we're not the only ones as well who are in this situation. Although, of course, in the sub-Saharan context, we have the highest import tariff, that is 30%. Others have 15% and so on. But at the end of the day, there'll be other people who are also looking at markets. For example, I heard that Brazil, of course, has been levied with 50%, which is very negative. But apparently China said, no, bring all your coffee to us. So they've managed to fill that gap. But that is very unusual and is not likely to be that easy for everyone that's looking for alternative markets.
What's the conversation, as far as we understand, between Pretoria and Washington? A call in the last few days between President Ramaphosa and President Trump. What do we know about what's on the table? There was that framework. Is that still in play? And do we know anything about the enthusiasm for that framework that we presented to the U.S.?
I think the call between the two presidents was a mere formality. At the end of the day, we did hear from the other ministers from the DTIC and international relations that they continue to, tug at conversations with officials in the United States to get a deal. It seems as though, in a way, they have been not been ignored, but they really haven't been responded to in the manner that they would have liked, because they came up with this framework. It was not responded to, and then they were asked to then now amend the framework, even though there was no discussion about the original framework. And of course, we know that the discussions that are taking place are not just premised on basic economics, they're also premised on politics as well. Which makes it very tricky. I've heard that one of the things that the United States would be keen for South Africa to do is to pull the ICJ case, and of course we have our Black Economic Empowerment legislation, which is apparently it's a non-starter for anybody to think that the South African government would consider tinkering with that, given the history of the country and the need to redress past discrimination, etc.
Tricky waters to navigate in the coming days and weeks, and I have a feeling you and I will be talking quite at length from time to time. Nompumelelo Siziba, senior SABC economics reporter, there unpacking it all nicely.